Welcome back to Hell to Pay. This is Elle, and I'm writing solo without the lads this week. But instead, we have the brilliant author Katherine Stewart, who's a journalist who's been tracing the rise of the modern religious right in the United States for over a decade. Her books include The Good News Club, The Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, and the recently released Money, Lies and God, described by the New York Times as an eerily prescient guide to the phantasmagoria of our political moment. Katherine, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Elle. It's always great to connect with you.
Likewise. So to kick things off, I'd love for you to tell us about Leonard Leo, one of the most powerful but equally one of the most mysterious figures on the American religious right today.
Well, Leonard Leo stands at the center of a kind of reactionary Catholic culture where fraternal organizations and think tanks and conservative clergy view their form of the faith as a real bulwark against perceived attacks on traditional morality and the family and the church. He's a dedicated culture warrior. He's a money man of the religious right. He views secularism as the greatest moral evil of our time. And he realized years ago that he couldn't get the policies he wanted if they were really put to a Democratic vote. Because, let's face it, most Americans, including a majority of Republicans, support abortion rights in some form, support birth control. The issue of same-sex marriage is even popular amongst many Republicans. But he recognized that if you can take over the courts, you can control the country. So that's really what he set about doing. He holds leadership roles within a number of organizations, particularly those focusing on the legal sphere. So he spends a lot of time drumming up money from billionaires and picking up quite a few million for himself along the way. And he's managed to, I would say, in effect, by the Supreme Court and turn it into an instrument of a kind of Christian nationalist plutocracy. And yet he still specializes in a kind of grievance politics that, if anything, I would say, says that anything that fails to affirm his worldview is somehow hostile to it. These folks are bleeding about how unprivileged they are, even as they are sort of privileging their religious and political viewpoints over all others. The Supreme Court that he curated is more or less responsible for Trump's second term because they really gave him a free pass. They gave him a free pass in any kind of meaningful criminal proceedings for his multiple felony charges. They have issued rulings that entrench a privileged position for those with approved reactionary forms of religion. And they've consistently ruled in favor of big money, right, against the people, against workers, against anything that gets in the way of the power of money. So a lot more to say. I'll just one data point in terms of how much power he has and how much money he has at his control. He is a trustee and chairman of what may be the largest political donation in history. The Chicago billionaire Barry Seid, who is actually Jewish, donated $1.6 billion to form the Marble Freedom Trust, and he put Leonard Leo in charge of it. And Marble Freedom Trust can spend $230+ million every year without touching the nut. I actually recently looked at their Form 990, so they put a lot of their money into Schwab Charitable Foundation and also the Concord Fund. But Schwab funds a lot of sort of ideologically and economically right-wing or libertarian causes. Concord Fund funds a lot of religious right causes. And then, of course, Marble Freedom Trust also sends a lot of money to the Knights of Columbus, which also campaigns for sort of religious right causes. So, Leo is, I think it really says something about the money behind this movement that you have a Chicago Jewish billionaire spending this money and putting, an ultra-conservative Catholic in charge of it. And it really shows that, religiously speaking, the money funding this movement is all over the place. Some of the funders are Jewish, some are Catholic. A number of them are evangelical or Protestant, and some are very atheistic. If you think about like the tech bros, people like Elon Musk and Andreessen, et cetera, who've put so much of their money into different features of the anti-democratic right. But what they're really after is policies that privilege billionaires, the billionaire class, policies that are going to produce an absence of effective regulation for polluting businesses, for instance. A lot of these folks say they're They just want, they're libertarian, they're pro-capitalist people. They want to let the markets do their things. At the same time, they're looking for privileged contracts for their monopolistic businesses. They're looking for, in many instances, taxpayer funding. So it's really about entrenching the power of this sector of the billionaire class and funding the culture wars, because that's the way that they get the little people, right? The foot soldiers, the rank and file on board.
Yeah, and can you tell us a little bit about how Leo got his start and what really drives him and motivates him, I suppose, just aside from money and power?
Well, those culture wars issues really matter to him. He sees himself as an ultra-conservative Catholic. He, takes a really hard line on some of the, those issues. He's one of those folks, he's not only anti-abortion, full stop, but he also is one of those who would characterize certain forms of birth control as abortion. And, he's probably gunning for same-sex marriage as well. So those kinds of issues, I think, are a big driver. But listen, he's also very much on the side of big money. Again, the culture wars, I often think of them as like the sort of laser pointer cat toy, sort of like red dot that, shines on the floor and, people, look at it and they don't see the bigger picture. So it's a way to get the rank and file on board. I mean, I think religious nationalism, it's interesting because, it's a form of exclusionary nationalism. It says that, there are those who are with us, take the correct points of view, and those who don't, the pure versus the impure. And it's a form of identity politics. And the right is always accusing the left of playing identity politics, but they play it harder. And we have to look behind all this sort of culture war nonsense that we see playing out in our politics today. There's this giant wave of plutocratic cash.
Yeah, and it seems to be never ending, which takes me to another group that I want to discuss, which is the Ziklag group, which is just another seemingly endless well of large money that has very right-wing, wealthy, religiously motivated donors. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about them. I think they're a lot more recently on the scene and how they have been particularly influential in the last American election.
Yeah, thank you for asking about the Ziklag group. A few years ago, I received an invitation somehow I saw a copy of an invitation to one of their gatherings, and it was the people who were allowed to attend were specifically high net worth individuals, and the minimum was like you have to be in control of an organization that is able to spend something like $25 million a year. $25 million. I mean, I'm a few dollars short of that. So I can attend. So what is the Ziklag Group? It's a networking organization for the Christian nationalist movements, very rich funders and activists and some key political leaders. And the name of the group should tell us something about the ideology. So in biblical translations, the Amalekites are referred to as raiders. The Amalekites were a group that went against the biblical Jews, and Ziklag was known as a kind of last refuge. So the Ziklag group today basically sees itself at the center of a reconquest. In this context, the name Ziklag really seems to have been chosen because the group sees itself as a sort of refuge of last resort, a safe place to regroup for mounting a counterassault on the forces of evil, which they see as liberalism, secularism, the woke, whatever. They see themselves as a sort of reinvention of a biblical sort of, we're going to mount we're in a war and we've got this place of refuge, and then we're going to mount a great assault, right? So while the Ziklag group draws in Christians who represent a multitude of specific theologies, and this is something that will interest you and dovetails with your own research, Elle. I mean, the Ziklag group embraces the idea of the Seven Mountains Mandate and the idea that Christians should take dominion over each of these areas of society as a way to structure its activities. So when I looked at that invitation that I had received, and I think there was actually a schedule attached to it, they had these sort of Seven Mountains workshops. Now, they also had representatives of a variety of religious traditions attending. You had some SBC-affiliated folks. You had some Catholic folks, right? And a lot of the folks weren't remotely attached to independent charismatic networks, which have kind of mainstreamed, in a way, this idea of the Seven Mountains dominionism. But it shows that the language and style of sort of these independent charismatic movements has kind of spilled over into other areas, other sectors of the Christian nationalist movement. So it's a case of certain kind of aspirational dreamed up visions becoming mainstreamed. As you know, Seven Mountains Dominionism reportedly got its start. That sort of ideology reportedly got started 1975 when Lauren Cunningham, who was a missionary leader, and Bill Bright, the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ, which is now known as Cru, they allegedly heard messages from God, and God was allegedly telling them to invade the seven spheres of society, or sometimes it's mountains or molders, right? This idea was popularized by people like C. Peter Wagner and Lance Wallnau, who kind of wanted to bring in new sectors of society into conservative politics. And they have this idea that when the right kind of people invade those seven spheres and take them over, it's taking dominion back from Satan. So they see again, that's not affirming their worldview as not just hostile to it, but sort of under the dominion of Satan. And now we're seeing this kind of idea sort of spill over into groups like Ziklag, which has a very serious following among very wealthy and very connected people who can actually make that kind of thing happen.
Yeah, and obviously that number 7 is really meaningful for a lot of people, particularly in the charismatic tradition, because it, represents completeness in the Bible. So it's really hinting to people, it doesn't have to say things out loud. It says that we're here to take over the lot. And that's given a lot of license to people who might not necessarily follow these religious traditions.
That's true. I mean, it's also kind of ideology that's coming out in different forms from higher brow journals like First Things and places like Hillsdale College, many of whose contributors and associates have now explicitly given up on liberal democracy and are looking for ways to seize power and remake society from the top down. So, yeah.
And you get people like Charlie Kirk and all sorts of people across the right-wing ecosystem now talking about seven mountains or seven spheres. So it's really broken containment of the religious organizations. And you can really see, which your book is really the point of how these groups are all interconnected. And, they don't always get along, as you make the point, but they have a lot of overlapping interests and they really take different ideas from each other.
They do. The movement is even drawing in sectors of it's drawing in the New Right, which is a movement that I would say on balance is less explicitly religious nationalist. There's some variation. Some of the members of the New Right are very Christian nationalists like Russell Vogt. Others seem very atheistic or actually draw their inspiration from Nazi political theorists. I kid you not. But they're more explicitly anti-democratic. And many of those representatives say they look for a red Caesar, a more monarchical form of government. They say democracy isn't giving us the policies that we want. It's not giving us the sort of social structure that we want. Sort of they have this fantasy of an American past in which everyone supposedly knew their place, and they want to bring about a new order, and they know that democracy isn't going to give them that. These folks, they wrap themselves in, the American flag and, wear white and blue and pretend to be patriots, but their ideas are as hostile to the foundations of our democratic republic as it gets.
Yeah, a friend of mine recently pointed out of how interesting it is to see these people at MAGA rallies or Reawaken America, which we'll talk about soon, and how much they actually embrace a lot of the aesthetics of the counterculture of the 1960s. It's very leather jackets, big beards, lots of denim and things like that. So there really is, I think that they really do see themselves as revolutionary and not in the traditional American way.
They're not remotely conservative. They're also trying to appeal to kind of, I would say, the rank and file. Like, I was at America Fest in December, which is Charlie Kirk's, Turning Point USA's annual gathering. It was in Phoenix Convention Center. There were 20,000 people attending. And I remember seeing, Steve Bannon gets up there with his 5 flak jackets layered on top of one another with, of whatever he's wearing. And he probably just got off his friend's $100 million yacht. He did. But he's just cosplaying as sort of renegade working person, even as he's, hobnobbing with these sort of billionaire funders, including, overseas billionaires. He had some kind of relationship with a Chinese billionaire yacht owner. And
he was arrested in Trump 1, wasn't he, on this guy's yacht?
Yeah, I know. Working man,
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so moving on, you've sort of spoken a little bit about them now, but the people who you designate as the spirit warriors, which I really like that name. I guess just how do you think that they've changed the evangelical right both in terms of practice of the faith and politics, and how they say differ to figures of the old American religious right, like a Billy Graham or a Jerry Falwell?
That's a great question. Listen, Billy Graham and Falwell, at least in the early parts of their careers, were segregationist. Falwell were, I would say, very segregationist friendly, like Graham, who was dismissive of Martin Luther King and the idea that segregation could end until we're in heaven. Oh, I'd really like segregation to end. I'd really, really like racial equality, but that's not going to happen until, we go to heaven. And then, of course, he's, allowing segregated in some of his sermons, segregated congregations, exactly. And they were both profoundly intolerant toward other forms of equality. They claimed that men and women are equal in the eyes of God while prescribing a separate, subordinate, and inferior status for women, right? It reminds me a little bit of that separate but equal, which is not equal at all.
Yeah.
Falwell blamed feminists and abortionists and gays on 9/11. But one key difference is that they appealed mainly to white Protestants and evangelicals. And broadly speaking, the independent charismatic networks and conservative Pentecostal movements are far more racially diverse and racially welcoming as a group. Not entirely, because these groups are very diverse themselves, right? But there are some still like white Pentecostal groups that are fairly, I would say, not particularly racially welcoming, but many of them are. And some of the most integrated spaces I've been to, and you've been to, I'm sure, are in these sort of independent charismatic networks, where it's like very explicit, we are all, together brothers and sisters in the eyes of God. So these the independent charismatic networks are transnational movements, and they're explicitly multiracial. So, when I use the term spirit warriors, I'm not referring just to those to adhere specifically to those networks, but also to those who've adopted the language and style of independent charismatic movements and those kind of modes of expression. But the thing I would say that they often have in common, although there are some differences. So I'd say on the independent charismatic side, they're dualists. They see Satan or evil as a real force in the world. They interpret the specifics of political conflicts in terms of their ideas about spiritual warfare. Now, Graham and Falwell were operating in an earlier era when they were still viewed as like fringe fundamentalists. They were nowhere near the center of American political power. The Republican Party knew they could make use of them and saw them as a very reliable sort of cohort, but they weren't like controlling the party. And they too saw signs of divine intervention playing out in our politics, but they weren't quite as specific in the details and perhaps had to pretend that they just wanted a seat at the table in the noisy form of American politics. Whereas I would say today, the Christian nationalist movement, broadly speaking, has really taken it over, and the wheels have fallen off the Republican Party. It's not a conservative party anymore. So we've seen an evolution. I would say that in an earlier iteration, the religious right looked more like a social movement concerned with legislating hot button issues. And the current iteration is much more aggressively political and politically radical. I mean, today's nationalist movement, they want a new political order, not just a new set of policies.
Very much so. And the way I've sort of described it to people is that they really, I mean, I think that they do believe in the culture wars that they're talking about. They really do feel besieged by the secular liberalism around them, whether it's in Hollywood or, NFL players kneeling or things like that. And they really do see themselves as a cultural minority now. And so they're able to take on Jesus' victimhood narrative for themselves. Yeah. So while it does sound very contradictory, I do understand how they're able to carve this space out for themselves while I fundamentally disagree with it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it turns out you don't actually have to oppress people. You just have to tell them they're oppressed over and over and over until they believe it. I mean, look at this like South African white farmer thing. South African, to be fair, may be a dangerous place to be. There are all kinds of murders, but this is not it just doesn't like, if you think that he thinks white South African farmers are oppressed, wait till he learns about apartheid.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, the people that are still at most risk of violence in South Africa today are black people.
I I know.
And one of our co-hosts, Sipo, is South African. So yeah, we've been talking a lot about this stuff, and we've got some more episodes on it coming up because it is going to be one of those just complete sort of folk devil issues that I think is going to be hanging around for a long time.
Yeah.
So speaking of the spirit warriors that we talked about, I was wondering if you could tell us about the Reawaken America tour. It feels, I guess you could almost describe it, I guess, as like spiritual MAGA rallies
Have you
that
ever
happen
been?
around the countries.
Have you ever?
No, I've
Oh,
been
Elle,
dying to go to
you gotta
one.
go.
I know. Everyone
It's
on
like
our
got your
beat
name all
gets to
over it.
go. Yeah, but I wonder if you could just kind of set the scene and just explain how this group became such an important factor in a lot of these, behind getting the foot soldiers together, I suppose, behind a lot of the political groups that you've been telling us about.
Yeah, well, for anybody listening who are watching who doesn't know, MAGA, Reawaken America is like a MAGA conspiracy fest. Now, Trump family members and MAGA insiders have backed it. It's a traveling roadshow of conspiracists and extremists, and it draws thousands of people to each of their events, and they typically take place in mega churches around the country. And these folks are indoctrinated in conspiracism and fear of any kind. It's like you go in this space and you hear about the Great Replacement and, COVID conspiracism, and there's 666 on the doors of the World Health Organization, and they're trying to microchip you, and they're controlling every dollar you make and tracking every penny you spend. I mean, it's really hard to express the extent of the lies and extremism in these spaces. And of course, the one, I think they're designed to confuse people. You're hit with this conspiracy and this one and this one, and this one, until you're spun around and you don't know what's true and what's not. But the one conspiracy everybody believes there is that the 2020 election was stolen, that Donald Trump has Jesus's hand on his shoulder. Like you see a lot of art there with, an American eagle with Trump there.
Always the eagle. It's always the eagle.
There's always an eagle on one shoulder and Jesus on the other shoulder. Trump looks like a young Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? And those messages coming from the stage, it's bad enough that you got thousands of people in those spaces taking it in. But you see a lot of this amplified through social media platforms and YouTubers and other kinds of programmers on the sort of America's far-right disinformation sphere that attend the gatherings or draw material from them or are associated with the various speakers. And then often they'll have like separate events for pro-MAGA pastors. Like Jason Lawmayer, he has a group called Pastors for Trump. He attended one and he sort of claims that, they're all like 100 plus, maybe hundreds of pastors. They had a separate day and they have their own programming. So these kinds of events really gin up this conspiracism and irrationalism that drive the MAGA movement. And unfortunately, here's the thing, we can't call this kind of thing fringe anymore. It's representative of what one of our nation's two major political parties have become. I mean, majorities of Republican voters are now living in this same fact-free disinformation sphere. They continue to believe the big lie that the 2020 election was stolen. They think Trump was and is the greatest president ever. They say that Trump's indictments are nothing more than political persecution from a weaponized system of justice. And they've been persuaded that a global cabal is trying to strip from them everything they hold dear. And what is this about? I mean, scholars of authoritarianism describe this destruction of the very idea of truth, the very possibility of reasonable debate. They say this is a key control mechanism. It demolishes the idea of reasonable discussion upon which a democracy depends.
And these things, I'm always really fascinated with how they've been much this new kind of cosmic right, whatever you want to call it. They do seem to be having a good time. They've made it a carnival atmosphere. They've even made, this world of conspiracy. It's like gamified. Like you can kind of choose your own adventure and go down whichever rabbit hole in your little, on your phone in the middle of the night. Do you think that part of it, that there is some sort of fun element to it, that people are just out there? It's just like, fuck it, the world's burning. Let's just have a good time.
I think there's a lot of cosplay. I think the leaders have made a really cynical bet. I think they think, they have such contempt for the people, but they're speaking to, but they're also working in this sort of fact-free bubble themselves. And I think if people, they repeat the same false narrative over and over to one another until they believe it. It points to something, I refer to this movement as a form of reactionary nihilism. It's nihilistic because they deny that there's any value in the truth, really. There's any value in the world as it exists. They don't have a problem. Did a lot of Republican leaders know that the 2020 election was not stolen? Of course they did. Of course they did. Remember those that were called cyber ninjas? It was a group of Republicans in Arizona that wanted to investigate allegations of voter fraud. And they were motivated to do it. We're Republicans. We're the cyber ninjas. We're going to come to the truth. And they did their investigation and they're like, we didn't come up with anything. In fact, Biden got maybe a couple dozen more votes than we thought. We're sorry, but there was no voter fraud in our district. But that lie didn't stop speakers at Faith Wins, which is, I described them in my book, Money, Lies, and God. And I described the scene where a member of the former Trump administration, this is right before the 2024 election, he's speaking to dozens of pastors at one of these pastor gatherings. He said, you all saw what happened in Arizona. Well, this is after this couple weeks after the cyber ninjas found no fraud. But they keep saying the lie because it's too useful to abandon. That's cynical. That is absolutely cynical. That guy knew the results of the cyber ninja investigation, and yet he continues to repeat the lie. Now, when you go to those spaces, as a journalist, I don't know, maybe we're weird. Let's think the worse, the better. It's not fun for me to go because I'm working. I'm looking for what's new. I'm looking for what's useful. There's a lot of great material. I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to get this all down. But then there's a sense of community, of course, and a sense of we're renegades and we're doing something new. We're breaking things, right? So I think for a lot of folks, that sense of just breaking things is very exciting. But what they're breaking is democracy. And it's a lot what are they putting in its place? And, back to that term, reactionary nihilism. When these folks talk about what they want to put in its place, it's always some imaginary version of a fantasy past that never existed in the way they think it did, but a version that has reactionary elements, a version of the past in which everyone supposedly knew their place. We know what that means, where there are certain hierarchies and everybody is just men are just honestly working the land and growing their vegetables. I grew up on an urban farm. Does anybody have any idea how hard it is to grow your food?
Yeah, and getting people with email jobs to suddenly
it's a lot of work.
working in factories or in the land. It's funny. I really think about a lot of these events like Reawaken America and just MAGA rallies and things like that is kind of akin to in fantasy novels or in video games how they call it world building. How you're given described this particular world that's different to what you know, and then you just kind of let loose to go in and play the game on those terms.
Exactly. Oh yeah, and it's going to be like this, and we're going to establish a new country in this little patch of land over here, and all the hot girls are going to move there. I was like, are you kidding me? All of this points to the fact we've really underestimated the importance of a kind of fact-based discourse in a functioning democracy. We fail to appreciate the many institutions and mechanisms that our society has developed over time. It wasn't easy to do it, to make this kind of reasonable democratic discourse possible. I know we all like to complain about the media and about the academy and public schools and the judicial system and all of that, but these institutions and their practices have played a crucial role in making a reasonable society possible and making it possible to deliberate matters of public concern, things that benefit everyone on the basis of fact and evidence and not superstition or fantasy or brute power. But here's the thing, that apparatus of reasonable discourse stands in the way of would-be demagogues and dictators who want to protect unreasonable power and want to protect the sector of oligarchs that sustain their unreasonable power. So the anti-democratic reaction has really set about trying to destroy the very idea of truth. And tragically, they're having a great deal of success.
Yeah, you mentioned public education, and I just wanted to go back to your first book, which I think was about 15 years ago, which is kind of how you got your start on this beat. And it was about the religious rights war on public education. So I'm wondering if you could just tell us, for starters, why they hate public education so much, but also what they're up to in the 15 years or so you've been following them and in which ways they've been successful.
Yeah, thank you. The destruction of public education as we know it has been a long-standing aim of the religious right I mean, I found sort of theologians who expressed hostility to public education as early as, from the time that public schools were started, particularly people like the Southern Presbyterian theologians who really abhorred the idea that the white taxpayers should be funding schools that, I'm not going to use the terms that they used, but the children of Black children of Black families, and then you had mid-century theologians like Rousas John Rushdoony, who is the father of Christian Reconstructionism, talking about how he was also, I think, a pro-segregationist. He tried to be a little clever about it, but he also endorsed this idea. He reprinted people like Robert Louis Dabney, who called public education atheistic and immoral, and so did Rushdoony. And that sort of hostility to pluralism and equality and gender equality, racial equality there's a through line, right? But when I published a book on the topic in 2012, the religious right activists who are working on the sort of anti-public education agenda, and the privatizers with whom they were starting to work hand in hand, were more discreet about their aims about destroying public education. There are really only a few people at the margins out there admitting that their end goal was to starve the beast, as they called it, of public education, or some of their representatives called it, and redirect the flow of taxpayer cash to private and religious and ideologically right-wing schools. But now they're really upfront about it. So the fundamental goal is to create a national network or national networks of publicly financed religious schools and right-wing, supposedly non-religious schools, but that schools that promote right-wing economic ideology that explicitly favor conservative forms of religion. So superficially, it looks like they're trying to achieve their aims by forcing their initiatives and programming into public schools or offering the public choice about what kind of schools they attend. Look, not every school is right for every child. I'm not full stop against charter schools. There's some great charters out there, and there's some very, very bad charters out there too. But on the religious right end of it, and a large sector of the charter network, they really don't like the fact that schools teach kids how to get along with others, including those who are different. They don't like the idea that public schools are meant to be non-sectarian, neither affirming nor denigrating any form of religion. So that's the apparent motivation of the 10 Commandments laws that mandate 10 Commandments displayed in every public school classroom. Or there was a relatively recent law in Texas that offers to pay schools to teach elementary age kids a highly sectarian Christian curricula. And then, of course, in Louisiana and Oklahoma, we have rules imposing the Bible in public schools. The expansion of charter initiatives is just the start of their privatization efforts. They want to, they mounted this case recently called St. Isidore versus Drummond that would have allowed for publicly funded charter schools that are explicitly religious. Now, last week, the Supreme Court issued a decision in that case. Coney Barrett had recused herself from the case because of her ties to one of the key lawyers who had represented one of the religious charter, and the court was split down the middle. So we were saved from a kind of terrible decision for the moment. But no doubt, look, we know about this right-wing legal ecosphere. They're incredibly long-range in their thinking. They're incredibly patient. They're probably mounting similar cases in other states for which Coney Barrett will not be able to recuse herself. So we shouldn't be surprised if we see a similar case sort of popping up in a different state in a few years.
Yeah, we did an episode a few weeks ago about Brown v. Board of Education and how that was really what, which is how that the Paul Weyrich and the Catholic right got evangelicals on board with the anti-abortion movement.
Yeah.
And it's just remarkable to think how far we've come, when Nixon, is just saying, guys, come on, this is unconscionable. You can't be doing this kind of stuff.
I know.
And, to now where there's the Leonard Leo that we spoke about earlier has engineered a Supreme Court that is probably going to completely change, not just a couple of decades of established law. I mean, really one of the founding ethoses of the country.
Yeah, I mean, the entire Republican apparatus seems to be on board. I mean, they're undermining public education at every turn. They're igniting needless conflicts and panics over critical race theory and things like that in order to foster mistrust in public schools, which soften the ground. Then, that helps prepare for wholesale assault. I mean, the conflict and division these initiatives are promoting in these diverse school communities are not an unintended consequence of their activity. It's really the point, right?
Yeah, but I also do wonder sometimes, I mean, do any of these kids spend any time with their kids? Because, you know, the more that you push your kids towards, it's like Stephen Miller is case in point. He's like a Malibu-raised kid of hippie parents, you know, who is now the leading, I would say, sort of right-wing demagogue brain in not only the Trump administration, but the country. And I get that this is a money and a power and a domination play, but it always makes me laugh because the amount of friends that I knew that grew up in conservative Christian schools and churches and families and very much not like that now is pretty substantial.
Yeah, I mean, you also think like, you know, of course, it's not rational. It's not meant to be rational because their aim isn't to seek fairness or to improve the schools. They really want to blow up the schools. It's like saying, oh my gosh, the grading system is so unfair. I have no choice but to plant a bomb underneath the entire school and blow it up. I mean, it's really what it's the equivalent of. And of course, like, you know, is there room for improvement in schools? Always, you know, but like, you know, I'm a public school mom and these are places my kids learned how to read and do math and, you know, learn state capitals. Like they're not these Marxist indoctrination factories that,
Yeah.
right.
With kitty litters in the corner for people who identify as animals to go to the toilet. Yeah.
And yet it's like, you know, I was just like on this long book tour and I met this woman in Arizona. She was super sweet. And she was like, well, yeah, we moved out of California to Arizona because the kids are identifying as furries in the public schools and they have litter boxes. And I was like, that's not a thing. And I was like, how old are your kids? She's never sent her kids to public schools. And she's like, oh, my kids are like 2 and 5. And I was like, if there are schools that have ordered litter boxes, and there are some, and the reason for it is that school shooting drills, if you're going to lock the kindergartners in their classroom because there's a school shooter, they need to have somewhere to go to the bathroom. And so some schools have ordered litter boxes as part of these school shooter drills because we as a country cannot like have reasonable gun safety measures, right? So, you know, mentally ill people are allowed to get guns and, domestic abusers and school safety is a real thing. So everybody has to do their things. I mean, it's such a tragic reason to have to do this that it almost makes you want to cry. You think about kindergarten, it's getting locked in their classrooms for their own safety, you know, for hours potentially while there's some threat and they're terrified. And I said, and I told her this. But she hears it every night on whatever Telegram or whatever, you know, weird right-wing, you know, far-right disinformation propaganda outlet she's paying attention to every day. And so I can't, like, my words don't get through. But I said, yeah. I sent my kids to public schools in California. This is not happening. There are, you know, kids are not like, this is not what you think it is.
Yeah, the lack of shared reality and common culture and that is such just a terrifying arc that goes through all of these groups and viewpoints that we've spoken about. Just finally, I guess as someone like me that's often a critic of prophets, I'm going to ask you to look into the crystal ball a little bit and just see where you see the religious right in the United States evolving in the coming years? And is there any particular thing that they want? And, you know, what's their game plan?
You know, I don't like to offer predictions, but I'm going to offer a few here. Is that okay?
Go for it.
First, I see continued radicalization. I think the process we're going through now is actually going to lead to an even greater and more complete rejection of democracy from these key players, from leadership, because they're going to find that our remaining democratic institutions are resisting or fighting their agenda, along with Trump's absurd executive orders. That's going to lead them to the conclusion that they have to simply get rid of democracy itself. So many leaders of the extreme edge are already there. That's why people on the new right are clamoring for a red Caesar or a monarch. Much of the rank and file will move in that direction too, because they've been told that they need to interpret any resistance to Trump as illegitimate, as dangerous, as something that needs to be overcome, that's satanic, it needs to be destroyed. So they're going to be also told to blame the failures of the Trump administration on that resistance or on the previous president or the Obamas or Nancy Pelosi or whoever, right? If that seems far-fetched, let's just consider that Trump is now blaming Biden, who is no longer president and wasn't even the candidate in the 2024 election, for his own failures. I mean, there's so many of his faithful followers that are willing to embrace that ludicrous story. Propaganda, works. But I also think that there is a real possibility that as Trump and his people destroy the economy, they make life less governable, less affordable, less navigable for ordinary people, as their policies impoverish even the sector of wealthy who have traditionally supported the Republican Party. There's going to be a real backlash. And I think the question is really whether Democrats can refrain from some of the infighting and purity politics and self-criticism that has sort of hampered their coalition and actually forge a workable and broadly appealing coalition and get out the vote. The question is whether disengaged liberals or left-leaning voters have learned from 2024 and will actually bother to turn out sufficient numbers in the midterm elections or in the next election, or whether they'll allow themselves and their votes to be sidelined. I mean, there are no guarantees, but I hold on to the hope that if there is a will to get it done, it can be done. We have to look at the last election. If you look at percentages by which Democrats and Republicans win elections, Trump won by a relatively small margin. It wasn't that, if you look at the number of eligible voters, he won by more or less the same number, proportionally speaking. If you look at the entire eligible pool, what happened was a lot of Democrats sat it out. They didn't turn out in the numbers that they turned out in 2020 for Joe Biden. By the way, Biden won in 2020 by a larger margin than Trump did in 2024. So we know that there is no substitute for turning out the vote.
Yeah, well, let's just hope that by the next election, people will still be able to.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But anyway, thanks so much for joining us. And did you just want to tell people where they can find you and your work if they're interested in reading more?
Thank you so much. Money, Lies, and God is available everywhere that books are sold. I actually just launched a Substack under Katherine Stewart Books. I'm on Blue Sky at Katherine Stewart at Blue Sky. And I archive a lot of my articles on katherinestewart.me. It's my website. Thank you so much for the interview. It was really great to talk with you today.
Fantastic. And we'll put links to all of that in the show notes as well. But thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Hell to Pay. Please subscribe, like, share, tell your friends, and stay tuned for more.